All right, so we got one today from Brad Jones via the Epic Times. Using Zero Hedge's clean interface, pro-Hamas group pushes critical race theory, socialism in the U.S. This will be fun. California woman sobbed as she learned her friend's 19-year-old son was kidnapped by the Hamas terrorist group in Israel. The next day, on October 12th, as news of the pro-Palestinian Day of Resistance rally spread across the United States, the woman, who is of Jewish heritage and asked not to be named for fear of reprisal, broke the tragic news. Her friend's son had been murdered by the terrorists. The same evening, a group of activists in South Los Angeles staged a protest in solidarity with the Palestinians. 2 days later, demonstrations again rallied, this time thousands gathering near the Israeli consulate, at one point shutting down the on- and off-ramps to Wilshire Boulevard from the 405 freeway. At the Thursday protest, activists equated the plight of Palestinians to those of indigenous peoples. They called the Israeli settlements in Gaza Strip an occupation steeped in racism. They blamed the capitalist Jews and white Europeans for the loss of their indigenous lands and called for a socialist revolution. Sound familiar? All resistance to colonial occupation is justified, shouted one speaker at the event. So that would mean, by default, all the Indians in this country can resist us and kill any American they want to, and it's because we're colonizers. That's what they mean when they say decolonization. Protesters chanted, "From Palestine to Mexico, border walls have to go. And from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," among other slogans. They blamed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for children killed in retaliatory attacks on Palestine and condemned Zionism, equating it with South African apartheid, fascism, and Nazism. That's cool. So you're calling the Jews Nazis now. This is like getting beyond the pale here. And remember, from the river to the sea, that means annihilate all of Israel. That's an open call to genocide. So for all the people, these are the people, these people right here, and this woman right here, are saying that Israel is genociding the Palestinians while they call for a genocide of Jews. So it doesn't really work too well. The protest at Martin Luther King Boulevard and Figueroa Street was organized by Union del Barrio and the Association of La Raza was involved. That's the Mexican nationalist organization. That's like the Mexican Ku Klux Klan. This is a smart idea to get involved with those guys. And other left-wing activist groups known for their support of critical race theory, or CRT, and the state-imposed ethnic studies program. Julia Walsh of the Service Employees International Union spoke out against Zionism. She called for defunding police as enforcers of capitalism, saying they should be ousted from the labor union. Another speaker called for a protest outside of Los Angeles Police Department station on October 22nd. "Let's take over the police station," he told the crowd of about 30 supporters. Meanwhile, on October 16th, Reuters Ipsos poll shows most Americans see Hamas as a terrorist organization, while they view Israel favorably. On October 13th, a Rasmussen poll found most U.S. voters blame Palestinians for the conflict and agree with calls for the eradication of Hamas. On October 15th, thousands of people showing support for Israel rallied in Los Angeles, walking down Pico Boulevard and the Museum of Tolerance. Now, the interesting thing there is, when it comes to eradicating, Hamas, how are you going to eradicate them? At this point, it's an idea. You could kill every single Hamas player and leader, and first of all, their main leadership is in Qatar, which you're not touching them, so they're still going to be around, but it doesn't matter because you could kill every last one of them. The ideology is still there. It's not gone. Ideas are themselves possessive. What happens is people don't really have ideas of their own. Ideas have people that become you become the mechanism that moves that idea forward, and it takes over you, and you then act in service of that idea. This is something that Jung talked about a long time ago, and it's quite readily visible here. Support for Israel. Rich Grinnell, a Californian and former U.S. ambassador to Germany, who also served as acting director of national intelligence in the Trump administration, condemned the recent attacks on Israeli citizens. He stated on Twitter on October 13th that Democratic Socialists of America and student groups that support Hamas are a real threat to America. Voting for Democrats who support socialists like @Dem Socialist and Sanctuary Cities policies will absolutely lead to people entering our country freely who haven't been vetted by U.S. immigration services. We must have a law that protects us against people entering the U.S. who support terrorists like Hamas. Which, yeah, that's a reasonable thing. Imagine how many Hamas sympathizers have poured across our porous southern border. Michael Schellenberger, an author and San Francisco-based political activist who co-founded the California Peace Coalition, and other groups condemned the terrorist attack on the Israeli people. We unreservedly condemn the atrocities carried out by Hamas and support the right of Israel to defend itself and protect its citizens, he wrote. The stories and images of the attack shock the conscience. Nothing on earth could justify such crimes. We condemn these on the radical left who have been defended the actions of Hamas terrorists. We are pro-Israel, by which we mean we defend the rights to exist and the right to defend itself, he continued. At the same time, we urge Israel and its supporters, including the United States, in their response to abide by international law in general and the Geneva Conventions in particular. That means doing everything possible to avoid killing or injuring civilians in the Gaza Strip. Kelly Shinkowski, an independent researcher, an education advocate, and critic of critical race theory being taught in California classrooms, denounced the protest pushing critical ideologies. Quote, we're seeing protests at college campuses nationwide in support of Palestine, but the issue does not just reside in our college campuses. It resides in the K-12 sector, especially within ethnic studies. The state-imposed media ethnic studies curriculum in California is filled with racial ideologies, he said. The same activists demanding safe schools promote anti-Semitic ethnic studies content aimed at decolonizing education and promoting critical consciousness and training in neo-Marxism. We need to defund anti-Semitism in schools entirely, she said. Deborah Fielman, a former teacher and education analyst in North Carolina, told the Epoch Times that California schools are teaching lies as historical information through its ethnic studies program. Of course they are. They're using the 1619 Project, which even in the author has admitted that it's false. It's just a reinterpretation of history to try and divide people. That's what it's all about. It's about creating division so that people are in and out groups, so that they will fight with one another, because it's much easier to control people when you have in-out group paradigms. And that is what we have done. And that's been the idea of the radical communists for about 60 plus years. They have been fomenting racial division since the 1960s. A lot of that stuff came from communists. They're doing it under the guise of social justice, which is false. There is no justice that can come from murder. There is no legitimate resistance that comes from the wanton slaughter of innocent civilians, she said. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free is a Hamas slogan that means all the Jews have to go, the eradication of Israel, said Mrs. Philman, who is Jewish. That's correct. The pro-Palestinian protesters aren't calling for a two-state solution, but are instead supporting Hamas when they chant those words. It is literally a war crime, every single thing Hamas did, including using their own people as human shields. Colonizer versus oppressed. Tammy Roseman Benjamin, a co-founder and director of the AMCHA Initiative, a nonprofit organization that combats anti-Semitism, told the Epoch Times that proponents of ethnic studies have used the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a way to essentially beat up their political enemies. The pro-Palestinian protesters are using the tenets of critical race theory to frame the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of the colonizer and the oppressed, she said. It's the whole binary oppressed-oppressor concept at the heart of ethnic studies that they've been expanded to talk about politics and international politics, she said. In this case, their political agenda aligns with Hamas' political agenda, which is to destroy Israel. Hamas doesn't talk about colonialism, she said. It talks about the Holy War, it talks about jihad, and it calls for ethnic cleansing of Jews from what it considers Muslim lands, Ms. Rosman Benjamin said. The recent beheading of babies, that story did not actually happen. So I don't like when you include lies like that babies were killed, they were not beheaded. That was an exaggeration. Rape, kidnapping, and massacres represent the worst and largest number of atrocities committed against Jews since the World War II Holocaust, she said. For Jews, this really is unprecedented in 2 generations. It's also being a little bit hyperbolic, because it's not as if, first of all, Hamas doesn't possess the capacity to annihilate all Jews, so that's not a realistic threat. Second, and while the October 7th mass attack was absolutely horrific, at the same time, we have to look at that and say, well, if you had an actual peace plan in place, and if you had followed the deals that you had made in Oslo 1 and 2, those settlements wouldn't exist, and they wouldn't have been raided, because those would have been a state. It's when you get hyperbolic and say that kind of stuff, it's not believable anymore. Because Israel's not perfect, they're not beyond reproach, and they deserve criticism for things. When they made deals and didn't follow them, what do you expect the Palestinians to do? I mean, I don't support terrorism, of course, but you cannot expect people making a deal with them, and then you break every component of that deal and keep building settlements on land that you agreed was theirs, and then you just keep building settlements, and then you wonder why they're mad. The Amsha Initiative issued a statement saying that it's shocked and horrified at the gruesome massacre of over 900 Israelis, children, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, entire families, hundreds of them gunned down at a music festival, reports of rape and torture, and estimated over 100 Israelis kidnapped, including children, the elderly, a Holocaust survivor, young women, teenagers, and families. The Jewish community in the United States is bracing for more pro-Palestinian protests across dozens of university campuses, expressing support for this genocidal campaign. The Harvard Undergraduate Palestinian Solidarity Committee and more than 30 other student groups recently signed a statement arguing that Israel's apartheid regime is entirely to blame for the attacks. However, following public backlash, at least 5 organizations that initially signed the letter withdrew their support. We will work hard to expose and combat on-campus supporters and apologists for terror, especially the faculty and departments who provide academic legitimacy for the murder of Jews while disingenuously wrapping themselves in the mantle of academic freedom. Our hearts are broken, but our resolve is not. We stand united with the Jewish people in Israel around the world. So again, I mean, as much as you might dislike some of that is freedom of speech. I mean, I don't support Hamas, and I don't really like people doing rallies in support of terrorism. That is the freedom of this country, is that if you're allowed to burn a flag, you're certainly allowed to, of this country, you're certainly allowed to fly the flag of an enemy, even though I think you shouldn't. And besides, it's a good thing. Let them come out and show their true colors, show who they really are. At the University of California, Santa Cruz, the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Department, which, wow, they have a Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Department. But remember, CRT is not a big deal. Which studies race intersectionality in the context of power, which is a joke, put out a statement on October 11th in support of the Palestinian people. In this moment, when we are grieving lives lost, fearing the many more to come, and witnessing Israel once again retaliate against trapped Palestinian population in Gaza, we want to underscore the need for study. What we are witnessing needs to be understood in the context of 75 years of settler colonial displacement, military occupation, and enclosure. As in the past, racialized media coverage dehumanizes Palestinians, delegitimizing their aspirations for freedom from militarism, colonial rule, and incarceration. They're not in jail. It's not an open-air prison. As far as it's not a colony either. That's not correct. The department claims that the world will be witnessing the circulation of technologies that are weaponized against Palestinians first and subsequently our most vulnerable populations in the United States on our borders and globally, and cites this as the reason why it supports the critical study of Zionism. The university has received pushback from at least seven members of the faculty, including Miss Rosamund Benjamin's husband, Elon Benjamin, a chemistry professor. On October 4th, the group sent a letter to the USSC Chancellor Cynthia Larive expressing grave concerns ahead of the inaugural conference of the Institute of Critical Study of Zionism, held on October 13th to 14th. Which I'm actually fine. Like, you can study Zionism. You can criticize Zionism. Zionism is a political philosophy. It's not a religious philosophy. Like, I'm okay if you want to criticize it. Just don't be hyperbolic about it. And, that's perfectly fine. Although the conference has been condemned in the Jewish community for its deeply offensive anti-Semitic content and goals, the letter focuses on the fact that the conference is co-sponsored by 3 academic units at UCSC, the CRES department, the Center for Racial Justice, and the Center for Creative Ecologies, the faculty members wrote. Center for Racial Justice, well, we already have racial justice in this country, so you don't need that. Center for Creative Ecologies, what is that? That's just a waste of time and money. While these 3 units may justify their co-sponsorship as a legitimate expression of academic freedom, we vehemently disagree, they wrote. It is an outrage that these 3 departments at a publicly funded university are not only sponsoring a politically motivated and directed conference that limits participation to those who agree with the conference's anti-Semitic goals, they are also committing their department to embracing these goals, thereby threatening their own faculty and students and members of the entire campus community. This is not a legitimate expression of academic freedom, but rather an egregious abuse of it. I'm going to absolutely disagree on that. I disagree with what they're saying, but they have the right to speak. You don't get to shut down their speech, even though it's abhorrent and offensive. You have to let them speak. And even though I dislike critical race theory, I don't think it should be taught in public universities because public taxpayer dollars goes to it. If you want to teach it in a private school, that's all up to you. I'm totally fine with that. If you want to do it on your own, that's okay. I don't like it at public universities. However, in this particular incident, what they're talking about is something that's a conference. And look, a conference is a conference. You're allowed to have a conference of bad ideas. I mean, it happens all the time on the left. You get together and they talk about all of their horrible intersectionality ideas. So I'm fine with them doing that. And you can criticize it, but you can't tell them that they're not allowed to do it. So fun stuff all around. Do have to enjoy people who look at murdered civilians and say, yeah, I support that. That's just terrible.